Welcome to the Vision for Life podcast, an ongoing conversation between the pastors of Fellowship Denver and the church at large. Each week, we talk about life, faith, the Bible, and how to follow Jesus as we go about our daily lives. I'm Autumn, the host of the podcast, and Andy, one of our pastors here at Fellowship, is joining me today. Andy, welcome.
Thanks. Glad to be with you.
Thanks for joining me on the podcast. We're going to be talking about church history today. We've been talking about church history for several episodes recently on the Vision for Life podcast. And so today we're going to talk about the church in the modern era. And this covers a lot of ground. We're marking it at 1635 up to the present day and are using a book that I've mentioned over the course of the last few episodes called The Pocket History of the Church by Dr. D. Jeffrey Bingham as to provide a sort of framework for our conversations. But you and I were just mentioning a moment ago that there's a lot that could be contained in this era, and we're interested to see where this conversation goes today.
Yeah, we're definitely interested because neither of us are professional historians.
Nope.
We're not experts on these things, and we were talking before we started about how, in many ways, a lot of what we talk about today will explain why it is that, modern evangelicals tend to be ignorant of history, or just not as deeply rooted as we probably should be. So I'm excited to kind of get into some of those because I think both of us sit here talking about these things and in some ways feeling like we're a bit over our head because we're not experts, but we're wanting to, engage and understand. And so, I think it'll be a really fun, fruitful conversation.
Yeah, I'm glad that you're willing to join me in spite
absolutely.
of the fact, that neither of us are experts in this topic as a whole or in this particular era of history. But we are both students of history, and we began this series of several conversations with a couple of episodes that were based on the book Priests of History by Dr. Sarah Irving Stonebraker. Hunter and I talked about that book in a couple of episodes, and the author, her thesis is based on the fact that we are living in an ahistoric age, and she notes a number of factors that point her to conclude that we're ignorant of history, sometimes willfully so, and that modern people tend to have a particular attitude towards history that is not one that's necessarily favorable or sees a need for history. And that attitude that is true broadly in our culture has impacted the church, impacted us. Andy, you were mentioning, that we can even see this impact in the evangelical spaces that we were accustomed to, or that we were in a sense raised in. There's a certain perspective of history, especially church history, that kind of marks the beginning of church history somewhere around the Reformation.
Yeah, that's right. I think today we're going to get into some of the reasons why that happened. But for many modern evangelicals, well-intentioned as they were, I think many of us just came up with a view of history that, everything was wrong for the first 1,500 years. And then Martin Luther just sort of fell out of heaven and set it all right. And so really that's really the only part worth getting to know is let's learn a little bit about the Reformation and then let's just read our Bibles and follow Jesus.
And we'll probably be good.
Yeah, we'll probably be good. But unfortunately, I think that, we're finding out that that leaves a lot of deficiencies in our formation as disciples. So,
What has your personal interaction been with church history? So if you and I sort of began at that point, Martin Luther was a gift from God, and church history began in somewhere around the 1590s. Which I'm saying, of course, tongue in cheek.
Yeah, of course.
That's not actually true, which is what we've been discussing on the podcast recently too. But from that point to the point where you are at now, what has your own interaction been with the study of church history? How have you started to find it to be helpful, whether personally for your understanding as a disciple or ministerially, just as you pastor people and preach?
Yeah. Well, I think that I began, as you mentioned, with a view of history that really thought that the only thing that mattered began at the Reformation. But then, I was able to go to seminary and take a handful of really good church history classes that exposed me to the entire scope of the story of the church in the world. And that was really helpful, and it was really eye-opening. And I think it challenged a lot of the assumptions that I had, that basically, there was Jesus and the apostles, and, we got the Bible from them. And then basically right away, everybody just got it all wrong and messed it all up. And and I think once I had the chance to just begin to read like the earliest church fathers, Ignatius of Antioch, Clement of Rome, and just begin to see the story of and even read the letters they wrote to churches that we read about in the New Testament, like Clement of Rome writing a church to the Corinthians, just a generation or two later. And guess what? The Corinthian church is still like this hot mess. And so you begin to see this historical connectedness, and you realize that in every generation, Christians are trying their best to navigate all the different factors of the culture that they're in and the worldview of the people around them. And you can look back at every generation of Christians and realize they maybe got this or that or a bunch of things wrong. But then you just begin to have a sympathy to realize there will be Christians 200 years from now looking back on us and on the movements we're involved in, and talking about the things that we got wrong. And so I think it's really just made me read history with much more sympathy and a much more open heart to say there is so much here for me to learn. So yeah, that's maybe some of my initial thoughts on that.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I've been dwelling on that idea of how the study that you just mentioned, how the study of history and understanding, especially of church history, helps us understand our connectedness to this historical community, but also really encourages a sense of humility in us. You just said, there will be, in a couple of 100 years, Christians who look back at the era that we are living in now and can very clearly see what we are currently getting wrong. And in the book that I mentioned earlier, this is one of the reasons in the preface that Dr. Bingham gives to encourage the study of history. He says that it helps us put our own experience and knowledge and practice into proper perspective, a perspective that begets humility. And I think that is very true. It both enriches our understanding of doctrine and the church, the story, the preservation of the church throughout history, but it also helps us realize that we too are sinful people living in an age impacted by culture.
Yeah. And I think that there are a number of other reasons I've discovered along the way that I think make history so important. I mean, if we believe in a sovereign God who didn't just create the world and wind it up like a clock and take his hands off, but who providentially rules over all of history. And so the study of history is, it's the study of God's providential work in the world. And so it's a way of meditating on God and his work. So I don't think we should, of course, the Bible holds a special place, the supreme place where God has revealed himself. But history is another book where God has revealed himself and his workings in the world. So I think too, like the Bible itself commends the study of history. Think of Hebrews 11, where the author of Hebrews just recounts all these key Old Testament saints and reminds us we are surrounded by this great cloud of witnesses and we ought to reflect on their lives. And, I think newsflash, people still have followed God all throughout history. So it didn't just stop with Old Testament saints. We have the courageous, the courageous life of Stephen, the first martyr of the church. We have all the saints throughout history that we can read and reflect on their lives and learn from their their courage, their faith, their failures, their restoration, and our own faith can be enriched in a lot of ways as well.
Yeah, that makes me think, Andy, of what the author of Hebrews is doing there in reflecting on all of those figures in Israel's history is something that God actually told the people of Israel to do time and time again, to remember, to recall their history, to recall God's faithfulness. And there are many moments in Scripture when the various writers of Scripture recount their history and call the people to a remembrance. And so that gives us a sense that God also thinks this kind of long remembering is really important for our understanding of him and his work in the world.
Yeah, absolutely. I totally agree.
Well, today we're taking on the task of talking about the church in the modern era. And so let's get into it. Let's talk about the church in the modern era, and we'll see how much we can shape up here for our listeners. I said earlier that this era we're identifying 1635 to the present, and the reason that we're doing that is that we're roughly following the divisions in that pocket history of the church. So that's where Dr. Bingham marked that division. But when we say the church in the modern era, what's kind of just a big summary? What's going on in the world or the church during this time?
Yeah, so I think maybe one way we could start is just by framing up the big categories of the modern era we'll look at, and then back up. So today we're going to be looking at the Enlightenment and the way that people started to think differently about the fundamental questions of life. We're going to be looking at the Great Awakenings, where the church experienced revival. We're going to be looking at Protestant liberalism, and then kind of movements of how did faithful Christians engage that. Then we'll look at missions, and then kind of the birth of evangelicalism. So that's sort of like where we're going. But when we think about like modernism and the church in the modern era, I think that, if that starts in the 17th, early 17th century, we should immediately ask like, okay, well, if that's the modern era, then there must have been a pre-modern era. And if this is a major shift, then like, why is it a major shift? And so we were talking just at a high level, like in the pre-modern era, it's helpful to know that like the fundamental question, generally speaking, of like even the pre-modern philosophers, think like Plato, Socrates, Aristotle, the fundamental questions revolved around metaphysics, which is really like, metaphysics is it's the rock bottom question of what is really real, what is ultimate, what is real. And so, the ancient philosophers had answers to that, whether that's an ideal world of forms, and we are to, and that's the ultimate reality, and our lives and our behavior should conform to that. Or, Christianity is not too dissimilar in that, we don't believe in an ideal world of forms. We believe in an eternal, unchanging, transcendent God. And so all of our knowledge about what is real and true and good and beautiful, and all of our understanding of how we should live in this world is anchored in the metaphysical reality of the triune God. And so big picture level, pre-moderns were focused on metaphysics. But once we get into the modern era, there's kind of what is known as an epistemic shift. It's the shift moves from metaphysics to epistemology, which is the question of how do I know what I know? How do I really know what is true? If I say I know something, how can I be certain that I know that thing? And so that kind of leads us into some of these key players. These intellectual figures that began that kind of began to ask those questions. The first was René Descartes, who famously said, "I think, therefore I am." like in your understanding, Autumn, like what was he getting at when he said, "I think, therefore I am"?
So René Descartes was a French philosopher, and you mentioned the phrase that he's most well known for, "I think, therefore I am." And Descartes represents a significant shift because he was questioning and even rejecting some of the philosophies that had come before him. And I think he was asking, so to your question, Andy, that question that you're saying, how do I know what I know? How do I know what is really real? And there are various schools of thought as far as how we should interpret that phrase. But he was rejecting some of the suppositions about the nature of matter and of the natural world in that statement. I think he was primarily a mathematician, but regardless, he was saying, I know what I know because I am thinking, because I have this faculty, because I'm able to reason and use this rationality. And that actually is reflected in one school of thought that came out of this era that you're talking about, the rationalists. And then the other school of thought was the empiricists, who actually said, they answered that question that you're posing, how do we know what we know, in a different way. They said, and this movement was characterized by like John Locke, David Hume, and they said, no, I know what I know because of my experience, because of my interaction and ability to perceive something through my senses. So I think I think if I'm tracking here, that those were kind of the two primary schools that grew up during this period.
Yeah. And so in both of those, what we see is this shift from metaphysics to epistemology. The main question is, how do I know what I know? And, and for Descartes, it was the only thing that I can be certain of is my own doubt and internal rational thoughts. Mm-hmm. So reason must be the foundation of knowledge. Yeah. And then the empiricists, like you said, they didn't reject reason, but they said, the only way you can really know something is if you can see it, taste it, touch it, mm-hmm. test it, handle it. Of course, someone like Descartes, who is a rationalist, not an empiricist, he would say, "Oh, that's nonsense because you can't know that your senses actually put you in touch with reality. What if you're living in a simulation? What if mm-hmm. what if you think it's a green crayon, but it's actually all in your brain? But either way, both schools were marked by this movement towards human reason, mm-hmm. Or human experience being the foundation for knowledge. And so what that did, the effect that did was it set off this sort of domino effect in the world that cast doubt on everything that came before. Mm-hmm. How can I trust an ancient text that tells me about a God who did this or that, or a man named Jesus who supposedly rose from the dead? How can I trust any of that? The only thing I can trust is either what I can reason in my head or what I can touch and see. And none of that makes sense to me, and I can't prove it or touch it or test it. And so I'm going to reject it. And so that mindset began to sink into the Western world and create sort of an atmosphere that was very skeptical now towards mm-hmm. the old ways.
Mm. And towards the religious institutions.
Yeah.
I think this was because there was a skepticism of the old ways and the ancient texts and philosophers who had preceded them, or major figures who, up until this point, had often been in religious positions and positions of religious authority. And so there began to be a real rejection of, during this era, the influence and authority of the church kind of as a whole.
Yeah.
One other major movement during this Enlightenment era was the scientific revolution. So, Andy, how did that begin to impact our understanding of reality and actually continue to challenge prior religious authority?
Yeah, so during this time, we actually saw the rise of of scientific work, not for the first time in history, but in a significant way. We saw an increased interest. I mean, and this in many ways flows out of empiricism, what I can see, taste, touch, what I can measure, what I can test. And so we saw the rise of like scientific discoveries. So like most famously, probably the one that people are most familiar with is Nicolaus Copernicus, who discovered that, the Earth, in fact, revolves around the sun. We have a heliocentric model of our solar system now, whereas before that, many embraced a geocentric view. And so just taking that Copernican revolution as one example of this fruit of scientific discovery, think about how that discovery converges then with just the skepticism in the air that was floating around from rationalists and empiricists, just distrusting ancient authorities, ancient religious claims. And now all of a sudden we know that our solar system is heliocentric, and yet the Bible will say things like the sun rose or the sun went down. And so for these new, modern, sophisticated people who are very skeptical, they would say, look at these ancient, ignorant people. They thought that everything revolved around the earth. And, if the Bible is wrong about that, then might it not also be wrong about all these other supposed truth claims it makes about miracles and about the existence of God? And so, the scientific revolution really cast even further doubt in many people's minds on the veracity of the Bible and the truth claims of Christianity.
Interestingly, many of the scientists who were compelled to study the natural world at that time were actually Christians.
Yeah.
And they were not intending through their work to challenge the veracity of Scripture. Right. They were studying the natural world as a way to understand it, and they believed better understand God and themselves and the nature of creation.
Yeah, that's right.
But the effect, when combined with the greater societal forces at the time, the effect of their discoveries was to cast, as you said, greater doubt on the truth claims in Scripture. So it was an age of skepticism and increasing scrutiny on not only the Bible as authority, but really many of the assumed authorities and figures and institutions that had preceded this era.
That's right. And I think there's an irony in it all, in that, whether the rationalists or the empiricists, they rejected Christianity as this sort of naive, superstitious religion that is built upon kind of a blind faith. It's like you guys, all of this is just built on this sort of blind faith. You're just accepting these things. But the irony is that every system, whether it's rationalism or empiricism, begins with a faith, with a belief in something that you can't prove. For rationalism, it's the belief that reason is an accurate source of truth. And the only way to prove that reason is an accurate source of truth is to appeal to reason itself, which is circular. It's called begging the question. And same with empiricism. The only way for empiricists to prove that what I see, taste, touch, measure puts me in touch with reality is to appeal to what I see, taste, touch, and can measure itself. And so again, it begins with this belief that can't be proven, that my senses put me in touch with reality. And so the irony in all of this skepticism is that their systems are built upon the very same initial leap of faith, if you want to say it that way, that really every philosophical system or religious system is built upon. And so this takes us back to, I think it was like Anselm, who was famous for saying, his famous phrase was faith seeking understanding. It wasn't, I need to understand so that I will believe. It's actually, I take by faith, I believe what God says that I may understand this world in which I live.
Yeah. Anselm wrote that, I think, between 1070 and 1080.
Yeah.
And so preceding this era. And yes, his quote is evidence of a very different understanding
Yes.
of the nature of human belief and our ability to know or understand something. There's a quote in the book that captures this kind of shift that we're discussing right now. And Dr. Bingham says it this way: with these new expressions of thought, it is no surprise that just as tradition fell in the Reformation, so revelation fell in the Enlightenment. And that's what we've been discussing here. Only reason, separate from any controlling authority, remained on the throne. Everything then became subject to rational argumentations. Well, we could dwell on this a bit longer, but we have more to discuss.
Yes, we do.
So we're going to talk about some of the response, actually, from the church and from church leaders in particular, in the face of these shifts in culture, this increasing belief on rationality and our ability to perceive and know things only through empirical means and by way of our own understanding. There were some church leaders who understood and saw those shifts in culture, sought God to do a move of the Spirit and began to pray to that end. And then one of the movements that we already identified that you mentioned earlier, Andy, that took place in this era, following what we've just discussed. So in a world impacted by the Enlightenment, by the scientific revolution, there actually were a couple of what we call great awakenings, which were revivals. So what do we mean when we say the great awakenings? What was going on at that time?
Yeah, so following the Reformation, so, this is why history is so important, because the Reformation happened, it dovetailed with this shift into modernity and this very rational age, this very scientific age. And so think about this. You've got this generation or two of reformers who are recapturing the historic Christian faith, and they're building institutions and they're planting churches, and they are establishing this new reformed faith in the context of a very rationalistic world. And you can imagine how that first generation or two that fought these battles were very passionate. They had skin in the game. They really, they loved God, and they were fighting for what they thought was true, and they built these institutions and wrote these confessional statements. But you can imagine 2-3 generations later, those who inherited the fruit of what their grandparents, great-grandparents fought for, they didn't have as much skin in the game, and they inherited institutions in which they were just raised, again, in the context of a very rational age. And so what began to happen over time is this gradual, almost like formalism. You might say it was like a cooling of the temperature of the church. They were orthodox. They believed the right thing, which is great in a rationalistic age, right? We believe the right things. And they did the right things. Like they believed the right things and they did the right things. But pastors began to notice kind of the cooling of the affections of the people and just sort of a slow settling into just a cold, rational faith.
Just a ritual, sort of empty ritual.
Yeah. And they began to, as you said, they began to say, this is not everything that God wants for his church. Yes, he wants orthodoxy. Yes, he wants orthopraxy, but he wants those things kind of lit aflame by the power of God. He wants hearts that are alive to God and love God. And so they began praying for God to move for revival. And so we begin to see these awakening movements begin to happen in Europe and in the United States. And so in the 18th century, this is the period, a period of awakening, especially in America, that we refer to as the First Great Awakening. But again, like I said, we saw movements start in Europe, like in Germany. We have the Lutheran Pietists. who were focused on reviving the hearts of the people. We have the Moravians, who very similarly were trying to gather people to pray and read the Bible and pursue God with passion. And, they began to emphasize in an age where, frankly, there weren't many Baptists yet. So most of these people were born and baptized and raised into a church. Well, one of the emphases of these movements was conversion. They began to call people to be converted, be born again. So think about people who were born and baptized into the church, who viewed themselves as Christians, and now all of a sudden, these people are saying, you might not be. You need to be born again. And so God began to use that. Kind of converging with that, we saw in England a sort of a reform revival movement known as Puritanism, or came to be known as Puritanism. This was within the Church of England. Again, it's just like some within the Church of England just began to see kind of the cold orthodoxy setting in, and they wanted to call for real renewal and revival among the people. And this group eventually broke from the Church of England and set off to America and established colonies. But very similar to the Pietists, they emphasized a whole life devoted to the glory of God, conversion, preaching, vibrant prayer, holiness. And it was like this earthy spirituality in the home, in every nook and cranny of life. And eventually, we get to a point in the 18th century where in America, we begin to see these outpourings, these incredible outpourings of God's power and God's Spirit. And during this time, Jonathan Edwards and others in America, people like William Tennent, who was a Presbyterian, or even traveling evangelists like George Whitefield, they began noticing similar things, and they began praying for God to revive the church, and they began preaching towards that end, calling people in a very serious and passionate way to kind of be shaken out of kind of their cold orthodoxy, and to be revived, and to repent, and to turn to God, and to awaken their hearts. And through the preaching of these various figures during this time, God did just that. God poured out His Spirit in an extraordinary way, an unusual way. And many Christians were revived. Many people were converted to the faith. And when God did this, when God poured out His Spirit during the First Great Awakening, it was accompanied by things that, frankly, were a little bit shocking to people, in a rationalistic age. It was accompanied by great emotion. It was accompanied by prolonged, like, weeping and wailing. People weeping and wailing in the streets. People displaying extreme emotion that was out of the ordinary, and really, like, made people wonder, is this really from God? And so a lot of the work that was actually done during this season of, like, immense revival was actually theological work. Some of the greatest theological writing and thinking that the church has in terms of what is true revival and how do you know when it's real, when this is really a work of God, was done during this period by Jonathan Edwards. He wrote a couple of books, one called Distinguishing Marks of a Work of the Spirit, in which he lays out, like, the true marks of revival and conversion. And then probably his most famous is a book entitled Religious Affections. And so again, like, just some of the treasure of this period is the theological reflection we have on revival that we still prize today in the Protestant tradition.
It's interesting that Jonathan Edwards, in his work, he didn't reject intellectualism.
No.
He was very theological, very intellectual, but he did start to attempt to recover some of this understanding of transcendence.
Yes.
He talked about beauty and the role that beauty plays in drawing us to Christ. He wrote about the beauty of Jesus Christ, and he talked about that as a way that our when we're drawn to Christ and when we experience conversion, that our affection and our will is reshaped. And one of his fundamental understandings of how that happens is through the beauty displayed, the beauty and glory of Christ. And so he began to, even though he wrote in a very intellectual way, he didn't reject that influence in his life, in his own theological training. He began to recover this idea of transcendence, and that impacted him in his teaching. It's also interesting in a prior episode, so in these series of conversations, one of the encouragements that was offered in this book that I've mentioned, Priests of History, was that an understanding of the past and our Christian heritage actually reveals to us this treasure of resources that Christians have used that really shaped their worship, their time with God, and their communities. And some of the resources that were mentioned in that book and that we brought up in a prior episode were about, for instance, prayer books that were used in family worship and in communal worship. But they were used in such a way that they actually structured the time of Christian communities on a day-to-day basis. So it wasn't something that they only used on Sundays when they gathered. They used it throughout the week to create a rhythm for their days, an expected time of prayer, a way that prayer and reading scripture grounded their days and was given priority in their days. And so many of those resources actually come out of this era of history, both from in England, and then you mentioned like the Moravians and the Puritans. The Puritans had a presence in England and in the colonies in America. And so many of these really rich resources that we can turn to and we can use, but even we can use them to deepen our understanding of prayer, of connection with God, and to see how it was used and displayed in the lives of people from this era are one of the ways that we actually can join that long historical conversation and understand how what God was doing, the way he was moving in that period of history actually still impacts us today.
Well, and I'm so glad you brought that up because, we're going to talk about the Second Great Awakening here in just a moment. But, for many in our tradition, kind of Reformed Protestant, we look at the First Great Awakening as kind of a model in many ways that deeply informs the way we understand revival in a way that we don't with the Second Great Awakening, precisely because in the First Great Awakening there was not a rejection of kind of the emotion, the experience, the event. There wasn't a rejection of that, but there was an insistence that if that is all you have, and it is not then followed up with a life that shows a transformed heart and makes its way into every aspect of life, even in what you do around the dinner table with your family and how you live in your home and how you conduct your business affairs. Like if what you experience in that great emotion, that you had at church doesn't spill over into all of life, Jonathan Edwards would have said, that's not real. That's not real. And that's a interesting contrast to the Second Great Awakening.
Well, let's talk about that.
Yeah.
Let's talk about the Second Great Awakening then. You said that's an interesting contrast to the Second Great Awakening. So what were the hallmarks of the Second Great Awakening? How did it differ from the first?
Yeah, so the Second Great Awakening primarily, if the First Great Awakening was in the 18th century, the Second Great Awakening was in the 19th century. In America, and I would just say some of the marks of this period of time in church history is, their understanding of renewal and revival was far less theological. and far more focused on kind of the emotional and the experiential. And really what they would do was they would kind of organize revival in many ways. They would host tent meetings that would go on for weeks. They would host meetings at universities, public gatherings that would go on for days or weeks. And the theological, I guess, underpinnings of this movement, I don't want to paint with too broad of a brush, but they largely were not informed by the same doctrinal convictions that drove like the Puritans or a man like Jonathan Edwards, which were very Calvinistic and believed that God must do a sovereign work in the hearts of people to awaken them to new life, to hear and believe the gospel and to be transformed. Like that was the conviction. Like we can preach and we can pray, but God has to work. But in many ways, the foundations that underpinned the Second Great Awakening didn't really focus on the need for God's sovereignty and power. It really focused more on methods that they believed could produce a predictable response in people. And so they would host these tent meetings. And one of the most famous figures during this era was a man named Charles Finney. And he very explicitly saw revival as a method, not as a miracle. And so these meetings were engineered to work up the emotions, and they were days and days long. So you're working up the emotions, but you're also wearing people down, so their will is actually getting weaker. And the preaching is very, it's just aimed to get people to make a decision. So you just imagine we're pulling all the emotional levers. We know, it's like I'm a pastor. I know how to tell a story that will make people cry if I want to. Like, it's just like, I know how emotions work, right? And so Finney was like a master at that. It's like, I'm going to pull the levers. I'm going to get people's emotions working. I'm going to wear them down after days of this preaching. And I'm going to preach in a way that just finally gets them to make a decision. And so in many ways, it was a kind of a mechanical period. Like, I don't want to say that it wasn't sincere, but it certainly was theologically misguided and has had a disproportionate effect on American Christianity. And so you just even the way, if you look around the church landscape today, so much of the church is just influenced by this manipulation of emotion and decisionism and kind of methods over just like reliance on the power of God.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think this is something that as people who work at a church, interact with many different people who have grown up in the American church, that factor, the way that a person can sometimes be manipulated, in a sense, by story, by appealing to the emotion, by creating a context in which they sometimes feel trapped until a decision is made. Yeah. All of those are an impact that we see in the American church from the Second Great Awakening. And that aspect of American Christianity is one that I have heard people bring up over and over as something that they struggled with in the various church contexts that they grew up in.
Well, I remember as a young Christian myself, I was in a season of awakening when God was drawing me to himself. And, I was sort of influenced by this sort of Second Great Awakening style of Christianity. And so I believed in Jesus. I was pursuing the Lord. I believed the gospel. But I had never had this crisis moment. I never had this dramatic moment when I prayed a prayer and I remember laying on my bed as a teenager, and I'm convinced now, I'd been a Christian for months by this time, but I just remember laying there and just thinking, I have never prayed a prayer yet. Everybody I'm around has the date and the time that they were saved, and I don't have that. And I remember I can look back, I just remember laying on my bed and praying and just feeling like I have to sort of have this crisis moment, this prayer on this day, or it's not real. And that's just a good example of just showing the long-lasting impacts of that sort of theological view. And many people even today feel like if they don't have a dramatic testimony of a crisis moment and a dramatic giving of their life to Jesus, that their testimony, that it must not be real, or at least it's not like worth telling, and that's all from the Second Great Awakening.
Interestingly, you said that there were these contrasts between the First Great Awakening and the Second Great Awakening. And the emphasis coming out of the First Great Awakening that we see clarified in Jonathan Edwards' work was what you mentioned a moment ago, the evidences of conversion in someone's life and the fruit of a whole life. That was his emphasis and the emphasis coming out of the First Great Awakening. Yeah. The Second Great Awakening was where we see this emphasis on a moment of decision.
Yeah.
It really emphasized the participation of someone's will and the way that this point of decision relied on human agency.
Yeah.
And that was the emphasis coming out of the Second Great Awakening. And so it is interesting how we all have experienced that. You and I and so many of us have experienced that in some form and seen this impact in the church in America.
Yeah.
If we move into kind of the next era, so we see the impact of the Enlightenment, the impact of this understanding of rational thought, the basis for human knowledge now. So this shift to empiricism has occurred. It's impacted culture, the whole Western world.
Yeah.
So in Europe, in America, there's been a response from these religious leaders seeking renewal and a move of God's Spirit. And we see God pour out his Spirit and draw many people to himself in the First Great Awakening. And that did occur in the Second Great Awakening as well.
Yeah.
That's why it's called an awakening. So revival movements occurred, and we can see their impact in the church, in America in particular, in the European church as well, although the European church after the First Great Awakening began to take a slightly different trajectory, a bit different than the church in America. But on the heels of these revival movements and the awakenings, in the 19th into the 20th century, another movement began to occur, it occurred in a different way in the European church. But we see it begin to happen in the American church in a way that formed a couple of diverging streams. And we call that liberalism, or you referred to it earlier as Protestant liberalism. Mm-hmm. So what starts to happen to the church next is the impact of rational thought empiricism continues to work its way into culture to become more mainstream sort of in every way. So it's no longer, just as we see happen now, it's no longer the belief of philosophers or impacting elite universities, or it's begun now to impact really all of culture and the way that everyone understands the natural world, the way that we know what we know. And so what is happening in this era in society and in the church that we call liberalism?
Yeah. So, society at large, and I guess maybe what I would want to clarify here is, so society is slowly being secularized, but it's mostly happening among the cultural elites. Like your average person still has this probably rich Christian cultural heritage in the background, right? But among the cultural elites and the academics, like they have embraced rationalism, empiricism. They've the findings and advances of science have even further solidified their skepticism about Christianity or ancient truth claims or anything like this. And so then combine that with like So this increasing skepticism among the cultural elites, combine that with the fruit of the Second Great Awakening, which was just this highly emotional, anti-intellectual faith. And now what you have in culture is Christianity, at least among the more thoughtful Christians, realizing like we are losing ground and we have no way to stand against this seeming unstoppable rise of just kind of a liberal secular society. We don't know what to do in the face of this radical skepticism of our faith. And so what you have then is the rise of what we call liberal Protestantism, Protestant liberalism. And in some ways, what this was, at least how I understand it, it was people recognizing kind of the movements of kind of the intellectual movements of culture and the skepticism of culture, and saying, if we hold our ground with like Orthodox traditional Christianity, we'll lose it all. Mm-hmm. Like society will just completely reject that. So we've got to figure out a way to make Christianity acceptable or palatable to this culture that is highly skeptical, that doubts the Bible. And so what these Protestant liberals began to do, and some of these people, like probably the most famous is a man named Friedrich Schleiermacher. But what they began to do is, essentially they just began to gut the historic Christian faith of all the things that offended the sensibilities of the rationalists and the empiricists and all the rest. And so the Bible, for the Protestant liberal was no longer to be considered the inerrant word of God, and its historical claims and its religious claims. That's not really what Christianity is all about. And so like Schleiermacher would argue that really all Christianity is about is this sense of dependence upon God. That's just this inward subjective sense of dependence upon God. And we follow Jesus not because he was the God-man or rose from the dead or any of that, but because he is the one man in history who just kind of exemplified this sense of dependence upon God. And so they really just kind of de-supernaturalized the Christian faith and kind of gutted it of its key doctrinal content and just reduced it down to something that a secular cultural elite could maybe get on board with. And so in many ways it was like, I don't know if I want to say well-intentioned, maybe it was well-intentioned, but it was like a missional impulse, we might say. Mm-hmm. And so I think there's a warning for us there.
Yeah.
That like our efforts to stay relevant in society can go sideways really quickly.
Mm. Yeah, what you're describing is they basically dispensed with many aspects of orthodoxy.
Yeah.
So they let those go because those would clearly, things like the Trinity and the bodily resurrection of Jesus, these clearly are not going to be accepted by a culture whose operating mode is to say, what can I understand by way of my own senses, by way of my rational thought, and that is apparent to me from the physical world.
Yeah.
Well, those aspects of Orthodox doctrine seemed to put them too much at odds with culture.
Yeah.
Yeah, I think it's right to call it a missional impulse. That does seem to be what, while we can't know necessarily their motives, it does seem to be that sort of impulse to say, this is what's going on in culture, therefore we have to adapt to that.
Yeah.
Yeah. So
that's something we talk about even in our like DNA class here at Fellowship, is we kind of talk about, as the people of Jesus on mission in the world, on the one hand, Jesus prays for his disciples in John 17 that God would not take them out of the world, mm-hmm. right? We need to be in the world, in culture, in the world, on the one hand, but then he prays, sanctify them in truth on the other hand. So we're to be distinct as we are in the world. And yet there's always this temptation to either syncretism, which is what we're seeing with Protestant liberalism, which is, in my effort to make Christianity palatable, I'm just going to kind of become a chameleon. I'm just going to end up like affirming just what the culture likes, right?
I'll get rid of the offensive parts.
The offensive
of
parts, right?
Christianity or the faith.
Exactly. And so that's why we see like so many churches in the last 20 years, like abandoning Jesus's sexual ethic, for example, and just becoming completely open and affirming.
It's that same impulse.
Same impulse. It's a missional impulse gone wrong, syncretism. But on the other hand, then there's the separatism, which we'll talk about in a minute with kind of the fundamentalist reaction to all this.
Yeah, let's do that. What was the reaction to this? As some of the church, it wasn't all of it, but as we're saying the church, sort of in a comprehensive way, as this liberal movement grew up within the church, began to let go of aspects of orthodoxy, began to let go of doctrines that, like we discussed, were actually questioned in the early church, were settled in certain councils that put forth creeds that clarified doctrinal position that the church actually held to and had from time to time made efforts to return to. And so all of that history, the creeds, those orthodox doctrines were being dispensed during this era. And so what was the reaction to that?
So the reaction was another reform movement. There's all these reform movements throughout church history when the church slides away. And I would say Protestant liberalism just became a false religion, which is exactly what J. Gresham Machen argued in his book, Christianity and Liberalism. So like, they gutted the Christian faith of its content, but kept its external forms and maybe some of its social actions. And so what happened was, those who were Orthodox, historic Christians in American culture and were hanging on to the truth, they reacted in a reform movement that has now come to be known as fundamentalism. Originally, fundamentalism was a really good, positive movement of hanging on to the core doctrinal contours and ethical content of the Christian faith. I mean, it's just historic Christianity. And so there was a document called the Fundamentals in which this was all outlined, and there were kind of new institutions being started, new seminaries that were breaking away from kind of the seminaries that were sliding into liberalism. And so it began as this really good reform movement to stay true to the gospel. But as is so often the case, over time, what begins as a good reform movement can begin to be an overreaction and go too far. And so what began as this movement to say, we're not going to go the way of the Protestant liberals, we're holding true to the Christian faith, began this movement of actually running away from culture altogether. It began really some of these fundamentalists anyway began to disengage almost completely or as much as possible from culture, just viewing it as like dangerous. I mean, look what happened to the Protestant liberals. They were enmeshed in culture, and look, they just slid off a cliff. We're not even going to get close to that. Like, we're going to stay as far away from that as possible. And so little by little, these churches began to become more and more insular, and their kids couldn't go to the same schools as secular kids, and they started even their own Bible colleges, and like they just kind of removed themselves from any way that they could possibly wield influence in culture anymore. And so if the Protestant liberals fell into the ditch of syncretism, fundamentalism eventually fell into the ditch of separatism, and they lost all cultural influence for the gospel, which is not where we're supposed to be as Christians. The church is supposed to be in the middle of culture with a prophetic voice calling people into the kingdom. And so, we could talk more about that, but that eventually led to kind of what you might call a third way movement or a middle ground movement known as evangelicalism.
Yeah. A couple of other realities that began to be present in the fundamental movement were, one was that it became over time an anti-intellectual movement because they were also reacting against certain institutions that they saw as being influenced by liberalism. Well, as you said, initially that might have been a good impulse, but over time, as they separated themselves more and more from those figures and those institutions, they also became more and more anti-intellectual.
Yeah.
And so it became a very anti-intellectual movement. And another sort of defining characteristic over time of the fundamentalist movement was that in their reaction against Protestant liberalism, they also withdrew themselves from culture in such a way that they were no longer really serving culture or serving their communities in a way that actually Jesus calls us to. They, to some extent, dispensed with the dynamic that you were just describing in John when Jesus said his disciples were to be in the world, impacting the world, and doing active things in the world, like caring for the poor, because there was a social emphasis in liberal Protestantism, fundamentalism also reacted against that and began to do less and less of that as they separated themselves more and more from society. So then you said there's another sort of third movement that grows up. Let's talk about that. What was this third movement?
Yeah, so this third movement was called evangelicalism, or that's what we call it now. Essentially, these people were all fundamentalists at one point, or there was kind of this reform movement called fundamentalism, but then there were those within this movement that began to see the overreaction, kind of the withdrawal from culture, the anti-intellectual impulses, the rejection of any sort of social action, all these sorts of things that they're like, wait a minute, we can't throw the baby out with the bathwater, otherwise we're going to abandon the very thing Jesus has called us to do in the world, And so this new movement of evangelicalism was formed kind of after World War II. Some of the key players in this movement were people like Carl F.H. Henry, who is the founder of Christianity Today, and really challenged Christians towards academic excellence and engagement in the marketplace of ideas in the culture. There were high level scholars like men like F.F. Bruce, who was a New Testament scholar in Britain, I believe. Was he British? I think he was. John Stott, who was a British pastor and a scholar. J.I. Packer, one of the most famous, like, if you want to say like the charismatic face of the movement at this time, was probably Billy Graham. He was a guy who he didn't want to retreat from culture. He wanted to get right in the middle of it and proclaim Christ. So he was sort of like, in many ways, the face of evangelicalism. But evangelicalism, what they saw is we have to rebuild in culture Christian movements and institutions that can engage our culture with the gospel. And so, like I said, so you have like the founding of seminaries. You have the founding of schools like Wheaton, that is to be this, like, it's a Christian liberal arts college that really is like in the original heritage of like a Harvard, which was originally founded as like a Christ-centered liberal arts college, but had kind of drifted. And so Wheaton was like the new Harvard or the new Yale in many ways. And it was a way of saying, like, it's a place for Christians to come who hold to the orthodox historic faith, but they don't want to withdraw from culture like the fundamentalists. They want to do the highest level academic work, whether that's theological or in the sciences, and do it all for the glory of Christ in culture. So that's like just a little bit about evangelicalism. I'm sure you have like a lot of things you could add to that I'm missing.
Yeah, to what you're saying, Andy, in many ways, the evangelical movement was a recovery movement. They were seeking to return to a sort of to recover this intellectual aspect of Christianity, orthodoxy, and doctrine that we see in the founding of these seminaries and schools. They sought to return to this emphasis on being salt and light. Jesus what Jesus calls his followers in the Sermon on the Mount. And they could see in the fundamentalist movement, because it had become a separatist movement, that they were no longer acting as a light. They were no longer being a light to their surrounding communities, or salt in the way that they were having either a purifying or preservative effect, because they had so separated themselves. And so some of the other organizations that were founded during this era were parachurch, what we call parachurch organizations. So they were faith-based, they came alongside the church, but they were social institutions like Youth for Christ that had a specific goal, an evangelical bent, in that they were clear, wanted to be clear about the gospel, clear about the historic gospel, but also were trying to make an impact in culture in a way that they saw as answering the Great Commission, as responding to the Great Commission, and being light in their communities. So there was a return to this kind of social emphasis, but in a different way. They were navigating it in a different way than the Protestant liberals had done, and in a different way than the fundamentalists had done. So trying to avoid these ditches that you described, trying to avoid syncretism, trying to avoid separatism. And then another part of this sort of recovery movement, as I see it in the evangelical movement, was that they, being connected to the Reform movement that we mentioned was present and evident in the first Great Awakening, also sought to clarify their position on the gospel. So on soteriology, or their understanding of salvation, how it comes about and occurs, and conversion. And so a part of this recovery movement was to also clarify that, their understanding of the gospel, and to again try to avoid those two ditches, to call people clearly to the gospel, and to allow the gospel, when needed, to be the offense. So to attempt to call people to the gospel in a way that was not offensive, but if then they encountered offense in Scripture, in the gospel, then that was, I think, what they understood to be the biblical way of presenting it, going about sharing the gospel. So those are the two things that come to my mind as being present in the evangelical movement. But I think it would be interesting kind of here as we conclude this episode to ask, given this, I mean, this is, again, in each of these conversations, we've been covering a huge span of history with the hope that this just leads our listeners to a little bit greater understanding of our own inheritance. And like I've used this term a couple of times, the long historical conversation that we, the church in the present era, are joining. And so I think as we conclude the episode, I want to ask, like, how do we see the influences and movements in this era actually impacting our church? So a couple, like, for instance, my mind immediately goes to, well, we are the inheritors of, we're evangelical. So we are the inheritors of the work that was done in this evangelical movement to recover a reformed understanding of the gospel, the sovereignty of God. The way that we want to position ourselves in the city is in line with that. So, for instance, that's one thing that comes to mind.
Yeah. Well, and I just think that's a really fruitful thing to point out, that we are evangelicals. We've inherited that tradition, and we embrace that tradition as those who want to be both orthodox and engaged in the world. And I think, like, one interesting thing to just point out about our historical moment is, among those who would call themselves evangelicals now, the thing we need to understand historically is it's not always crystal clear how to faithfully engage culture, right? And so that's like, so we're living in this moment and this movement that is committed to Orthodox Christianity and engaging culture faithfully. And yet what we're seeing now in evangelicalism is a bit of a fracturing, or just like not everybody fully understands what it should look like to faithfully be the church in culture. And so that's like 100 years from now, there will be historical reflection on this moment and what is happening right now as evangelicals are trying to learn, like, how political do we be, for example? How activist do we be? These sorts of things. So I think that, like just to see the story that led to where we are is really helpful. We kind of talked about as well, just even the way we've shaped the values of our church are really connected to this whole story we've been talking about today. Like, one of our values is, so all of our values are connected by the word and in many ways, that's a very evangelical impulse right there, because it's an attempt to avoid two extremes by connecting these two words with the word and. And so one of our values is word and deed, right? Word meaning we want to be committed. We want to be Bible people, committed to Scripture, committed to what it calls us to do. And we want to be people who actually live that out in the place God has situated us. And so from our reflection today, just one example of that we saw was the fundamentalist movement was a movement that saw the word being abandoned by Protestant liberals. And so in this good impulse to lean in and be faithful to the word, they eventually moved so far that they abandoned the deeds. Like, and don't get me wrong here, they read their Bibles, they love Jesus, they preach, but they sort of withdrew from culture and they stopped doing the things in culture that we talked about. So like, that's just one like really good example of how one of our values of our church is tied into this historical story, because we don't want to make that same mistake.
Yeah, I love thinking about our values in this way because they have been shaped by this big historical story. And so another one that we talk about, that we identify, for instance, in our DNA class, which is our class for newcomers or anyone seeking to be a member at Fellowship Denver, one of the values that we talk about that shapes our church is what you just said, word and deed. Another is what we call doctrine and life. And so in our conversation today, you described how over time the church had tended toward this kind of ritual. So they were believing the right things. They were perhaps even doing the right things, so outwardly living in a way that was right. But there was still eventually, with a few generations removed from the reformers and the reform movement, a way that became empty, a sort of empty orthodoxy. And then in the First Great Awakening, we really saw that challenged. And so there was still an emphasis on doctrine, on believing the right things. But also in the work of Jonathan Edwards, we see this emphasis on the fruit that produces in a life. So doctrine is not only significant because you're believing the right things. A true sort of doctrine, a conversion, leads to a life that is fruitful in the way that it's described for us in the writings of Paul, for instance. A life that actually displays the values of God's kingdom in every aspect of life. So in the way that sort of life goes about recreating, living life at home. This is what we talked about in the sort of Puritan movement, that they sought to orient the whole of their life around Scripture and around these rhythms of walking in step with the Spirit. And that impacted every facet of their life. And so this emphasis on doctrine, believing the right things, and life, actually we can see displayed in this historical story.
Yeah. And this is even reflected in the values of our church here at Fellowship Denver. So we have a number of values that we have laid out. And one thing that anybody who visits us or joins our church will recognize is that each of our values is actually two values joined by the word and. And interestingly, that's just a very evangelical way of thinking, because like evangelicals were trying to be the and people. They didn't want to be the Protestant liberals, and they didn't want to be the fundamentalists who like totally disengaged. They didn't want to fall in either ditch. They really saw that there's a way of holding things together. And so one of our values is word and deed. And what that means is we want to be people that proclaim the truth of the gospel, but we also need to be like a church that is engaged in the world, doing the works of Jesus in the world. It's when those two go together that we really experience like missional power in culture. And so this deed is connected to this, or this value of word and deed is it's deeply connected to the story we've been telling even today, because what we saw in the fundamentalist modernist controversy is we saw, the Protestant liberals, they were abandoning the gospel. They stopped proclaiming the true Orthodox gospel, but they had all kinds of social action in the world. Mm-hmm. The fundamentalists, they reacted to this and they wanted to hang on to the gospel and the truths of the gospel, but they overreacted and they just insulated themselves and separated themselves from society, and they proclaimed the gospel to themselves in their own churches, right? They would proclaim the gospel with passion, but they withdrew from society and they stopped doing the deeds of Jesus in the world. And so you can see why we would hold a value like this as evangelicals. Mm-hmm. We want to be people who both proclaim the truth of the gospel, but we also want to be people that do the deeds of Jesus in the world. We think those can and should be held together.
I love the way you said this story actually has shaped our values. Another one of the values that we talk about as a church and say shapes Fellowship Denver is doctrine and life. And I think this is being displayed in our discussion today in the story of Jonathan Edwards. So in the First Great Awakening, as a response to a church that had come to be characterized somewhat by some empty ritual. So they said the right things, they believed the right things, and even to a great extent lived moral lives, but had a sort of empty orthodoxy. Jonathan Edwards began to emphasize the necessity of the impact of the gospel in every facet of life, and said this is actually the evidence of the work of Christ in a life, when the gospel influences and impacts the way that you go about living as a family, the way that you worship, the way that you even recreate or spend your leisure time, that every area of life is impacted by the gospel. And so our value of doctrine and life is, I can see, shaped by these historic values that were present in our discussion today.
Yeah.
We could go on, Andy, but for the sake of everyone, including the rest of our day and our listeners, we're going to just wrap up this discussion. However, I do want to encourage all of you listening to continue to think about the inheritance we have as Christians that begins actually with the story of creation, takes shape through the story of Scripture, is also present in the way that God is moving in history throughout all of these eras of church history, and then is taking place through us, through our participation in this story and in living lives impacted by the gospel today. So I hope that these conversations have been encouraging to you and will just whet your appetite to continue to think about this, to continue to read. And as always, if you have questions about today's episode, or if you have suggestions about what you'd like us to discuss on the podcast in the future, you can send all of that anytime to podcast@fellowshipdenver.org. Thanks for joining us on the Vision for Life podcast. Special thanks to Adam Englund for our theme music, to Jesse Cowan, our producer, and to Judd Connell, who provides transcription for these episodes.